Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Marisa LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event tonight with Ben Tarnoff and Moira Weigel, presenting their book, Voices from the Valley. Tech workers talk about what they do and how they do it. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you again for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these unprecedented times. So every week we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. And as always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk, you can click on the Q&A button right at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Voices from the Valley from harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up tonight and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, but we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Ben Tarnoff is a writer with expertise in technology, politics, and history. He is the author of the books A Counterfeiter's Paradise and The Bohemians, and is a co-founder of the technology magazine Logic. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, and The New York Times, among many other publications. Moira Weigel is a writer and junior fellow at Harvard University. She's the author of Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating, and she is also a co-founder of Logic magazine. Her writing has appeared in The New York Times, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, among many other publications. Their new book, Voices from the Valley, is an illuminating, in-depth examination of the tech industry based on anonymous interviews with tech workers at all levels. Publishers Weekly writes that it is an insightful account, does much to illuminate an industry often shrouded in secrecy. And Anna Wiener, author of Uncanny Valley, calls it timely and important, and an exciting new genre of tech narrative, hopefully the first of many such chronicles to come. We're so pleased to have both Ben and Moira here to discuss the Voices from the Valley tonight. Without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Ben and Moira.
Thanks so much, Marissa. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks so much to Harvard Bookstore for having us. Harvard Bookstore is one of my favorite bookstores, certainly, and I really would like to echo Marissa's point about the importance of supporting Harvard Bookstore in particular and independent bookstores in general. At this time, they're struggling and they need our support. And if you felt like it, you could buy our book, which would be nice. Our book is also part of a broader series that Logic is doing in collaboration with FSG Originals. There are 4 titles in the series as a whole, and they're really interesting books in our opinion. Moira is holding them up. You can see they're also, I think, very attractively designed. So I'd encourage you to check those out. We also have an event with all of the authors in the series tomorrow that's being hosted by City Lights Books. You can find some information about that on our Twitter account, logic_magazine. Thanks also to all of you for coming. We know this is a difficult and stressful time. Zoom is a weird and awkward format. We will do our best to overcome all of these obstacles and provide what we hope will be a useful and interesting conversation. We're also very eager to hear from all of you and kind of drill down into the particular things that you'd like to talk about. So briefly, this is a book of conversations. It's conversations with people about the kind of work they do. And in our case, these are people who perform work for tech companies. In other words, these are the people who make up the industry that is transforming an ever-growing share of our social, economic, and political worlds. An industry that has become so powerful as to acquire a kind of sovereignty over many different aspects of our lives, but yet whose inner workings, whose inner lives, we could say, most people still know relatively little about. I thought I would start with reading just a very small portion of the introduction that opens this collection of conversations. I know that reading is never a terribly exciting thing. At least I often don't make it terribly exciting, and Zoom is really not the format in which to try to make it exciting. So I'm going to keep it very short, and then Moira and I will have a bit of a conversation around some of the themes of the book, some of the things that came up as we were putting it together, and then we will open up to Q&A and we can talk with you. Great. This book is a tell-all about an open secret. Platforms are made by people. For many people, it can be easy to miss. There is the matter of word choice. Platform instead of publisher. AI instead of statistics. Tech companies have many reasons to speak as if their products run themselves. To obscure the human work involved in training an algorithm or moderating a social media feed is both a sales pitch and an evasion. The pitch for investors is scale. A tech company will grow at superhuman speed. The evasion is of liability. A tech company will not be held responsible for what it breaks by moving this fast. For users, this is part of the promise too. No gatekeepers, just a frictionless exchange of ideas, goods, and services. May the best meme win. Pay no attention to that man inside the black box. This book will introduce you to the people behind the platforms. These are the people whose work in one way or another shapes almost everything you do. How you find a job or a lover, get approved for a loan or flagged for a police stop, rave about a movie or fight about a president. In recent years, the power of the major tech companies has become impossible to ignore. For the first time, many politicians and pundits are attacking them as monopolies that inflict a wide range of harms on society, from promoting fake news and hate speech to eroding our privacy and attention spans. And as moments of conflict or crisis arise in some companies, dissidents and other discontents have spoken up, leaking audio and screenshots, talking to reporters, walking out on the job. But it remains relatively rare to hear the ordinary people at those companies speak in ordinary ways about what they do. In this book, they'll speak to you in their own words. So that's just a small taste of the introduction, and hopefully gives you a bit of a sense of what we're trying to do with the book. Next up, I thought I would hand it over to Moira. And Moira, I might ask you, this is inevitably a kind of awkward format, but Moira, I thought I would ask you to talk a little bit about why we decided to write the book.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you again to Harvard Bookstore. Harvard Bookstore is a magical place, a pivotal place for both of us. A place I remember spending the last, $20 in my checking account when I was a student to get some new book I was excited about probably too many times. So it's important for me and all the other students that it still be there. Anyway, thank you so much for having us, and thank you to everyone for being here. So Ben asked me to remind us why we wanted to write this book. And, a long time passes between when you first decide to write a book and when it comes out. And in some cases, like 2020, the world changes in some dramatic ways too. And so it's nice. It's a real question, a real chance to reflect. I think the project of this book, why we wanted to write this book, has a lot in common with why we started Logic Magazine in general. It was part of a desire to pull back the curtain a bit on this industry, on the tech industry, which is enormously powerful, right? And we all know what a big role tech companies play, shaping our personal lives, shaping our social lives, shaping our politics. God knows that's on a lot of our minds right now. And yet, as Ben was saying, it can be really hard to find out much information about what's happening inside tech companies that doesn't come in the form of PR. They can be quite secretive. The communities around them can be quite tightly knit. And as a result, we felt back when we were starting Logic, and I think the germ of the idea for this book kind of got born in 2016, 2017, that a lot of the information, whether it was positive or critical, was sort of based on industry hype, reacting to industry hype, and often, felt kind of cliched or thin. We wanted to get at more of the texture of people's lives who build these tools that shape our lives and everyone's lives in these profound, sometimes frightening, sometimes exciting ways. And in addition to that, I have to say, I at least love listening to people talk about their work and how the machines they work with, the processes they engage in really work. And so for me, at least, there was a pleasure and a privilege in getting to hear people's stories in their own words. And that was part of a project that at Logic and for Ben and me, we felt pretty passionate about, felt pretty important to us to let people who weren't usually allowed to speak in public, speak to the media about the important issues coming out of these companies, do so in their own terms. Ben, do you remember other reasons why we got started on this?
No, I thought you laid it out perfectly. I'd like to pick up on something you said, which is the feeling I share, which is the pleasure and the privilege of listening to people tell their stories in their own words. And I think in addition to it simply being fun, it is fun. I think there were a few other reasons that we felt strongly about that format, or kind of the value that we saw in that format. I think the first is that one of the reasons that our view of the tech industry tends to be quite distorted in many respects is because the people who are permitted to speak on its behalf are the people at the top, the executives and the investors, and they speak quite loudly, particularly recently over social media, through the mainstream media, as being quoted by reporters. They're able to speak freely. They generally don't face consequences for speaking very freely. In fact, they're celebrated for it as being truth tellers, speaking truth to power, although that's not quite how it works in my view. But inevitably, that means that we hear the same small handful of voices when we're hearing from quote unquote Silicon Valley. And in reality, Silicon Valley and the tech industry more generally is made up of all sorts of different kinds of workers. And it's these individuals whose labor actually makes the industry run. So there was a pleasure to listening to these stories, but I think for us, there was also a politics and an ethics to bringing these voices into a conversation that is typically dominated by people at the very top. I would add that another reason for doing so is that, frankly, you'll get a more accurate view of what's really going on. This is something that comes up, I think, a lot in one of the conversations included in our book with a data scientist who kind of mercilessly skewers a lot of the hype around AI, explaining that a lot of this is just marketing and it's being done in order to obtain venture capital funding. But when you look at the technologies underneath, they don't really hold up the claims that these companies' CEOs are making. So inevitably, and it makes intuitive sense, but we don't have an opportunity to do it very often. If you want to understand how something works, you should talk to the people who help build it. And so that was another, I think, element of our approach was, we'd like to learn what's actually going on as well.
Yeah, thanks for enlarging it that way. And I think also, maybe we'll touch on this a bit later in the conversation or in the Q&A, but I alluded to how long it sometimes takes between when you have the first germ of an idea for a book or a little magazine and then when it hits the world, when it comes out. And I think, there's actually been a pretty substantial change since 2016 or 2017 when we started working on Logic and talking about wanting to have this more critical and informed perspective on the tech industry. I think in 2016, we were living in San Francisco. When I'd come home to the East Coast, most of my friends who weren't involved in tech would say, "What are you talking about? Why would you be working on this or preoccupied with this?" I think it still felt to an extent like concerns about the effects of social media, of algorithms, of many of surveillance capitalism, as it's now commonly called and known, still felt like maybe niche niche concerns. And that's really changed. That's really changed since 2016, whether we're talking about the impact of a book like Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism, or the conversations coming out of Congress, or The Social Dilemma, which is the number one film, not the number one, but one of the top films on Netflix right now about the harms of social media. I think that there's been a shift since we started toward a lot more broad interest and a lot more critical interest in the tech industry. But what hasn't changed so much is the voices of who gets to speak for the industry. The conversation may have changed, the people in the room hasn't changed all that much. And so we wanted to bring some other people in.
Yeah, I think you're right, Maura, to emphasize this point about how much has changed in recent years. And I should say this is something that's difficult about writing about the tech industry in the form of a book, because as Maura mentioned, books are slow moving. This magazine that we publish, Logic, comes out 3 times a year, so that's also pretty slow moving. But the target is very fast moving, right? Because the tech industry, there are some continuities, but it's changing pretty quickly. The technologies around it are changing pretty quickly. The different paradigms are changing pretty quickly. So, it's always a kind of question of marksmanship, maybe for lack of a better metaphor, of how to hit that moving target. I think among the things that have changed since 2016 is not just the conversation about the industry, both the kind of conversation within the halls of Congress and the conversation in the mainstream media, as Maura alluded to, but also conversations within the industry itself. And this is something that comes up in our conversations, in our interviews in this book, as folks talk about here and there what changed for them after 2016. 2016, there was a major inflection point around the presidential election, the election of Trump. And without placing too much emphasis on any single point, because the question of continuity and discontinuity is always a complicated one, it's safe to say, I think, that the election was a turning point of sorts for workers in all layers of the industry, where they began to have more conversations, broader conversations with greater urgency about the work that they do, about the role that the industry plays within broader society, about how their workplaces are run and organized. Again, conversations that had been going on in certain quarters, but I think reached a new breadth and depth in the months and years following the presidential election. And that's, I think, a theme that comes up throughout our book as people are processing a bit of a conceptual shift in how they see the industry, how they see their work, and how they're connecting to kind of broader social and political developments that are happening, in the country at large. Before I pass the baton back to you, Maura, I just want to mention that we'd love to hear from all of you and get your questions. If you have questions for us, there's a little Q&A icon in the bottom of your screen. If you click that and type in your question, I think, in the next 15 minutes or so, we'll probably kick it over to questions. If we don't get any questions, you can just hear us ramble on indefinitely. So that's an incentive to put some questions in there. But Maura, back to you. Any impressions or new directions you want to take the conversation?
Well, I was going to ask you, actually, Ben mentioned that 2016 in the tech industry, as in many places in the United States, I think felt like this moment of reckoning, a moment when people were questioning their work and what it meant and what role their work was actually playing in American society, and whether it was maybe different from the role they thought it was playing. But what I wanted to ask you to expand on a bit, Ben, was that that was also a moment, there'd been a lot of blue collar organizing of contract workers in the tech industry that merged very directly in some cases with engineers and white collar workers who were concerned about their work, served as a direct source of inspiration and solidarity. And so I was curious, Ben, if maybe you could speak to that and also use it as a jumping off point to talk about some of the voices in the book and who actually are the characters in the book, and what makes this, I hope, a sort of different kind of insider account of tech. Who are the new people in the room?
Yeah, absolutely. A great question. I think one of the implicit arguments of this book is that the tech worker it needs to be understood as a broader category than how it's traditionally conceived. I think tech workers, the kind of general popular view of who a tech worker is the software engineer. And the reality is that a tech worker describes anyone who performs work for a tech company, whatever that kind of work is, whatever their employment status, whatever their kind of occupational status. And so within that category are included many subcontracted service workers who perform essential labor on the campuses of big tech firms in Silicon Valley. These folks are security guards, cooks, shuttle bus drivers, janitors, and so on. And without their work, the industry doesn't run. Their voices, as Moira mentioned, are typically not included in the conversation about tech and who the tech worker is. And they tend to earn very low wages, despite working for some of the most profitable companies in the world. They also live in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. So long commutes are common. Second and third jobs are also common. And we have one conversation with a cook in our book who has deep roots in the Bay Area and gives us a lot of perspective on the experience of service workers in the industry, but also a kind of longer historical view of having seen the industry transform where they grew up and what those transformations felt like kind of at the ground level, which is, I think, a pretty powerful conversation. Now, Moira mentioned that a lot of these service workers have successfully unionized, which is something that had begun before 2016, and through unionizing have managed to secure a degree of stability, certainly wage increases, better healthcare benefits that have made still a very difficult situation a little bit more tolerable. But one of the interesting developments, which I would say we see glimmers of in our book, but is not really the main focus, is that their unionizing efforts provided a really important source of inspiration and influence on a wave of collective action that started to take place within the white collar layers of the tech industry in 2017 and really reaching escape velocity in 2018. Folks may have heard about actions like the Google walkout, which is this very large global coordinated action by Google workers to protest sexism and racism at Google. That's I think a particularly visible and kind of big example of what I'm talking about. But there were some interesting convergences between these different layers of the tech industry where relations of solidarity and kind of mutual recognition and inspiration were built across these very large occupational and class divides of the industry.
Yeah, and I think just to second what you said, for me, I love all the conversations in the book. I hope they're all interesting conversations to readers, but the conversations with two of the contract workers who've actually lived in the Bay Area for the longest and can speak to what the last bubble, what the last boom was like and how it changed the landscape and how their work changed, in a way provide a perspective that is really rarely represented, I think, or I'd rarely read represented around Silicon Valley, and that I sort of most cherish in a way, although of course I cherish all our interlocutors and conversations. I thought, Ben, since you're closer to the machine than I am, since you're closer to the tech industry than I am, maybe you could talk a little bit about what nonetheless surprised you, or like whether there were moments, because I can think of a few, but moments in these interviews that made you see the industry differently or see something new about the kinds of people you worked with.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I'll respond briefly, but then I want to hear you answer the same question. I mentioned earlier that there are these occupational class divides within the industry because you have a lot of different kinds of workers performing different kinds of work in different employment statuses, different wage levels, and so on. I think I had understood that before we began work on this project. I think I didn't have an appreciation for just how fine-grained some of the distinctions can be within this hierarchy, that it's the kind of polarities of it, the kind of extremes of it were visible to me. But the conversations that we have in the book, include a few folks who are kind of somewhere in the middle, who are, kind of white collar, kind of blue collar, maybe pink collar in one case, kind of service. There's some interesting middle ground, I think, and precisely because the industry actually requires so many different kinds of labor to run, which is a fact that is often suppressed by the industry. Because as we're getting into a little bit in the portion of the introduction that I read, it's very important to the mythology of Silicon Valley that they present a view of highly automated processes, that there aren't actually people behind the platforms. And of course, we know that that's really not the case. I mean, it's absolutely true that a company like Google employs far fewer people than Ford or GM did at their height. But on the other hand, all of these decisions about content moderation on social media, about how these different automated systems are being designed and implemented, these are all made by people. And there's a lot of work that goes into obscuring and obfuscating that. But to bring back, that long tangent to this original point, those people, all of those people who make the industry run, are themselves organized into this very kind of complex matrix of occupational and class divisions, and have access to different levels of resources, different levels of respect and recognition based on where they fall into this quite intricate hierarchy. And I made this point before at risk of repeating myself, but there are several Jane Austen novels one could write about the social complexities here. I mean, there are many kind of novels of manners that one could write, that presumably need to be written about this world. But I'll stop talking. Maura, what did you find most surprising? And then we actually have a couple of great questions that we can turn to.
I was going to say, I'm going to go with Henry James' novel, or perhaps our friend Anna Wiener's Uncanny Valley. I think, anyway,
That's
many
better.
different ways to represent the different social complexities. Let's see, I think, and it was so fascinating. I mean, Ben spoke to the fine grainness of some of these differences. There's one interview in the book with a massage therapist who was contracted for a time at a big tech company. And she talks about who in the office she was allowed to work on or not. Some people were allowed to come in for physical therapy and some people weren't. And she, in one instance, mistakenly thought one person needed it and then wasn't allowed to do it. And so anyway, these very subtle and sometimes not subtle, but these ways in which these feelings and hierarchies play out in space and everyday interactions, I think I learned a lot from the folks who talked to us about. I think, it's hard to generalize about this in too broad strokes, but for me, I think, someone who doesn't work in the tech industry, I work in academia, and with my teacher hat on, I'm so curious who all of you in the audience are and what work you do and what background you're coming to this from. If we were in physical space, I would put some of you on the spot and try to make you answer here and now. Would love to see anyone in the chat if you want to weigh in. But for me, as someone who does not work in the tech industry, I thought some of the most interesting moments were when people explain sort of how these big stories and big media narratives that sometimes get talked about, narratives like the culture war at Google, or, these more libertarian understandings of tech versus these more nationalist understandings of tech, may emerge from really precise aspects of the dynamics inside companies and how work's organized. So for instance, we have a long interview with someone who worked at Google for a long time. Only person whose company is identified in the book, but we have a lot of folks at some large tech companies speaking here. And the Googler talks about how these big shifts that have been reported in terms of the Google culture wars in a lot of way grew, in their opinion, out of these management changes within the company and sort of new business models, new ways even of organizing people in the space of the office, and new protocols for different teams to interact. And I'm always so interested in those kinds of insights, you know, because I think we often attach really big abstract ideas to our technologies. And there are good reasons for that. But then in a way, you know, all technologies arise out of these social relations and these everyday kinds of relations. And so I loved learning about that and sort of having these big media narratives grounded in the everyday. I think also, you know, my first love was literature, and I'm still a sucker for these sort of emotional moments. And we also have an interview with a founder who is someone, you know, from the out, I think I and almost anyone from the outside would think of as an extremely successful person. And they talk about failure and the way one can fail up in Silicon Valley, and that sort of emotional texture of what it feels like to become an extremely successful professional building things that actually nobody ever gets to use because your product gets bought by a bigger company and closed down, or, you know, you work on something for 5 years and it doesn't actually ship, it doesn't actually work. And that person talks, I think, in a really interesting way, on the one hand, about valuing this tolerance for failure, you know, that there really is something to this optimistic idea or this kind of mythology of Silicon Valley, that it's open to taking risks, you know, throwing yourself into big hard problems that don't work out. But then also that, you know, it calls into question what success is, and also whether, for this person, whether they were working on the right problems in the first place, or whether they should have tried and failed at sort of more ambitious problems. And so anyway, those are just two examples. But I think hearing about both organizationally and concretely, and then emotionally, the texture of everyday work and sort of the human life and lives underneath these big stories or big, you know, narratives about the valley, that you fail better, fail up, that's something I really valued about the process of putting this together. And I hope readers take something from too.
Absolutely. I think that's really well put. And before we turn to questions, there's something you said that I want to draw out and emphasize, which is, you mentioned that often we found in our conversations that business models are some of the most interesting elements to drill down on and have a lot of significance for what is sometimes glossed in the media as culture wars. I mean, I think I've read the phrase, the culture war within Google, at least a half dozen times. And I think that kind of speaks to a core organizing principle of this book and of our work with logic as a whole, which is this basic faith in historical materialist perspective on how things work. One of the things that's really nice about these conversations, I think, is that you can kind of see that perspective in action. You know, often we think of the personal scale and the structural scale as completely different, or we kind of hold them analytically distinct. But in reality, in our everyday lives, those scales completely interpenetrate and co-produce one another. It's very difficult to disentangle the personal from the structural. And I hope with our conversations that is really illustrated, that you see people who are making very personal choices, who come from very specific personal backgrounds, who've had very specific personal experiences and are talking about those, but are nonetheless shaped and in turn shape these broader structural forces that set the kind of parameters and context for their personal choices. And to me, I think it's really fun to read. I'm biased, I think it's fun to read, but I also think it illustrates the kind of basic idea of historical materialism, that, you know, how people produce the conditions of their own lives, and at a broader level, how these companies produce profit and function as capitalist firms within the market is often, not always, but often the most interesting element that we can look at when we're trying to understand how people or how firms actually work. how they're actually functioning. I hope that doesn't sound too mechanical. I was going for organic metaphors, and then it became very machinic, but that does happen with logic sometimes. I thought I would turn, Maura, I see you unmuting.
I just wanted to say, and I think, I've been haggling folks as I would if I were teaching to ask who works in tech and who works elsewhere, but and nobody's taking me up on it. But I think, one aspect of this book, or one thing I hope, is that this book speaks also to people who don't necessarily work in the tech industry or have a special interest in the tech industry. And I think the things you were just saying, Ben, about work and how people make meaning out of it and how much it means to people is actually really universal in a lot of ways. And that there's a tradition, and I wouldn't presume to say we're joining the tradition, but a tradition we admire and thought of for inspiration of writing about work and how people feel about it, from Studs Terkel to Vivian Gornick to writers more Silicon Valley specific, like Ellen Ullman or Anna Wiener, who I mentioned before. There's a whole sort of new millennial novel or genre of writing about millennial work. And I hope that in addition to illuminating those aspects of the industry that you were highlighting, Ben, that there's a way in which this book speaks to that genre that we admire so much as well.
Definitely.
Are you going to take questions and open?
I'm going to take questions. We got great
Good.
questions. I want to give them plenty of time. I love that you put a question in the chat and it's just crickets. It's just, I love to see that. That's the kind of awkwardness on Zoom that we celebrate. We've got 6 questions.
Ben.
We need to get to work here. Great question from an anonymous attendee. Do you believe that tech workers are a strong, possibly the strongest lever of change in big tech? Or should we be looking more generally to civil society orgs and public policy to drive change? I'm going to answer this one briefly, and I want us to get to all the questions. I think a lot of the enthusiasm that I've observed for tech worker organizing that's come outside of the industry has often made this point, which is that at a moment in which other channels, regulatory, legislative, seem to be blocked, that organized tech workers might be the most powerful force for meaningful change when it comes to bringing these companies under a degree of democratic control, or at minimum mitigating some of the harms that are associated with their operation. I think that's an appealing idea, and I think that there are inspirations that we can draw within the labor movement. The idea of bargaining for the common good, where you have nurses who are organizing with their communities, teachers organizing with their communities, building those alliances, to say nurses' working conditions are your healing conditions, teachers' working conditions are you and your child's learning conditions. There's a lot of potential for solidarity and for kind of really constructive dialogue across those divides. And it's honestly, it's exciting for me to think about what that might look like for tech. Ultimately, I would add a cautionary note, however, which is that particularly when we're talking about the more elite layers of the tech workforce, white collar, full-time workers at big firms, these are folks who already possess a fair degree of social power. So I think the solution would not be to invest those folks with even more power. I think the hope is to bring them into kind of democratic relations, into these solidaristic alliances with the communities that are using these technologies and who are being affected and targeted by these technologies. I hope that's helpful. I know that sounds a bit vague, but that's about as much precision as I think I could put on it.
I think also, I know we want to get, there's so many good questions, but I just want to add, I think in a way it's all of the above. And one part of the Logic project from the beginning was to try to bring together sort of different constituencies. I think for a long time there have been academics doing excellent work on the perils of the power vested in big tech firms. There have been civil society orgs, sort of grassroots activists, artists, journalists. And I think that what's been exciting about the past few years is to see some of these constituencies come together, and the exact configuration will change depending on the situation, but that bringing together those different stakeholders and actors is really crucial.
Absolutely. I've also got some good news, Moira, which is that the reason that no one responded to you, I've just been informed, is that the chat is disabled. So it wasn't as awkward as I had hoped or feared.
Well, thanks for mentioning it again. That makes it less awkward.
Just bring a little more attention to that. Hannah Masuga says, I'm very excited about this book set. Thank you, Hannah. And I love the concept of marksmanship with picking what to write about given the pace of tech. Find that slower and longer horizon tech writing is most insightful, maybe because historical amnesia seems common in the tech industry. Could you say more on this subject and an approach to picking topics, which I assume is referring to logic as well? But how, Maura, maybe you could take this one. How do we do that? How do we hit a fast-moving target while moving slowly?
That's a great and difficult question. I actually, when I saw it in the chat, picked up Adrian Daub's book, What Tech Calls Thinking, which starts with this line I love. It's another book in the series, reviewed in the New York Times today, in fact. And Adrian opens his book, "This is a book about the history of ideas in a place that likes to pretend its ideas don't have any history." And I think that little chiasmus, it works. It's not just cute, because I do think that there's so much amnesia in the tech industry and the tech hype cycle. So that's certainly part of what Logic as a project wanted to push back against. I think, this question of choosing how to choose a topic is an excellent question and a really hard one. I think besides not getting too distracted by hype and by these sort of narratives of novelty and the machine learning application or the AI that's going to change everything, or the social app that's going to change everything, this kind of drumbeat of the new that's always coming out of the industry. It's important. Let's see. What I was going to say, and I worry is a bit of a cliche, but I'll say anyway, is to try not to get too distracted either by that rhetoric of novelty or by critiquing that rhetoric of novelty, but to drill down in something that seems interesting and important anyway. I think there can be a certain, the tech industry and the people who get to speak for the tech industry the loudest certainly offer plenty of opportunities to critique them and saying things that drive academics and researchers crazy, ironically, just end up drawing more attention to them sometimes, I think. So I think in terms of choosing topics, my advice, I'd say, for what it's worth, what we look for at Logic too is a topic that someone is really passionately committed to and isn't, wants to be framed. We want it to be framed in reference to a broader conversation, but not in reaction necessarily to that conversation. You want a community you're committed to, a problem you're really engaged with, and that connection to the present or to the big conversations will always come, because everything is a reflection of the whole in a certain sense. So I'd say, we look for subjects that aren't too blinded by the rhetoric of novelty or sort of I was going to say glamour, but it's not the right word, the sort of loudness of the loudest voices, and that then feel a real connection to places, people, communities, problems that the author can dive into. And I'll keep thinking on it, but that's a first answer.
Thank you. Allison Buki has a question, a speculative question, which is, what do you see as the potential impact of a Biden presidency on the organizing momentum you've described among tech workers? And says, thank you for your work. Allison, thanks for being here, and thank you for the question. I think, as I mentioned before, the Trump election, I think it's fair to see it as a catalyst for collective action efforts among white-collar tech workers. That said, while I think supplied an important catalyst, I don't think it is all that necessary anymore as a frame now that things have kind of reached a certain level of momentum, if that makes sense. I think it was a really important starting point for a lot of conversations around the role of the industry, the role of technology more broadly. But I think those conversations have developed to a point where they're going to continue no matter what. There are organizing challenges, of course, at the moment. COVID presents a major one. The bad state of the economy presents an obvious one. So I don't mean to paint too rosy a picture, but I think in this particular case, kind of removing Trump from the equation, I don't think actually does very much to dampen that momentum that we've been describing. Maura, anything you want to add there, or should I go back to the Q&A?
I'd agree, and I guess a bleaker way to state what you just said is also that I think that the problems people have been organizing around will not change under, or will not disappear under a new administration. So, yeah, there are important reasons to keep organizing around these issues and building power around them.
Maura, I have a question for you and for me. We can both speak to this one, which I think links to the COVID piece, which I alluded to briefly in the last response, but we haven't actually really dug into yet. Wendy Reposarda says, tech is working from home these days, a very different scenario than in 2016. How does this format affect the people from your book? How does it dilute or empower tech's mystique and power? What do you think?
I mean, it's a fantastic question. We were just checking in with some of the folks we interviewed to send them copies of the book and see how they're doing. And we're asking different folks about how their work is going now or what life is like now. And it's true that there's a way in which, you know, these accounts of working in 2019, which is when I guess we did most of the interviews, feel like science fiction now, you know, because we're also used to being at home. I think that on the one hand, in the short term, the fact of everyone being remote has increased and exaggerated divides among different people who work for tech firms, which this concept of the tech worker that Ben talked about and some of these actions on tech campuses had tried to overcome. I think, you know, this idea that everyone who works at a firm is a tech worker and has things in common, it depended a lot in certain ways on proximity and physical space. You know, the massage therapist I mentioned would interact with the engineers and with the cafeteria worker. The cafeteria worker would interact with the technical writer and the founder and so on. And those kinds of human interactions were really important, not just for the pragmatics of organizing, you know, of putting together an action or a protest or something like that, but also for developing a sort of sense of identity and togetherness. And that's gone. And that poses several significant challenges, I think. At the same time, while in the short term, it would seem that remote work perhaps further privileges the people who are already privileged and disempowers those who are less privileged. I think this perhaps frightening reality, and I saw an academic speaking to this a bit in our industry in the Q&A, is that being remote makes all of our work easier to replace and move around and break up, and will create incentives for companies to do that. So I think that it's a tricky question, and depending how long this goes on, folks are going to have to find new ways to try to recreate that interaction in the cafeteria or outside the office that humanizes and connects people working together.
Yeah, I think I would answer this question by also looping in another question in the Q&A from Bix Archer, which is, how do you see the potential for solidarity across different kinds of workers when so many companies have moved to working from home? And of course, white collar workers are able to remain at home. For many of the big firms, they've continued to pay their subcontracted service staff. There have been layoffs at some firms of those folks, but many of the bigger firms have kept them, which is good. I think there's an open question of how long that will continue, particularly if we're kind of in this pandemic for the foreseeable future. So, you know, I think that occupational kind of class complex structure that we were describing earlier I think that it's going to kind of get even more stretched out, and we're going to see a pretty unequal industry become even more unequal. And not only between the folks who can stay working from home and the folks who can't, but also within the white collar category, we're going to see, I think, a lot more gradations. Maura mentioned that one of the aspects of all of us working from home is that it becomes easier to distribute and potentially to eliminate certain kinds of work. And just to give you a concrete example of how that's already beginning to happen, all of these big tech firms have moved to remote work. In some cases, they're saying you can work from home indefinitely. And a number of white collar tech workers have moved out of the San Francisco Bay Area into other places. Rents have actually come down a little bit in San Francisco from a very high level, of course, and they've actually been going up in places like Reno, Nevada. So you have white collar tech workers fleeing these expensive real estate markets, but taking their, high tech salary. But their salaries, some of these firms are now being adjusted lower because they're now in new labor markets, because the cost of a software engineer is lower in Reno, primarily because of housing costs, than it is in San Francisco. And so I think that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on, because even at the relatively privileged, relatively elite layers, there is inevitably, as there always is, downward pressure on wages. And COVID is kind of creating a new pretext for that dynamic to emerge.
The only thing that occurred to me, sorry, and I do want to get to more questions, but to add to that is that for folks in California or who follow events in California, I think everything that's going on around Prop 22 and gig worker organizing is kind of interesting to follow in this respect. Because of course that doesn't map precisely onto this working from home versus not able to work from home division, but it does present a model of organizing possibilities and challenges among people who are dispersed and whose work has been sort of broken up and algorithmically sorted. And we've seen some of that with Instacart workers during the pandemic, and we're seeing it with ride hailing workers in California now. And so I think also that looking to how folks who are not full-time employees engaging in this kind of gig work have dealt with the challenges of not all being in the same office or having the same employment status might be one place to look for ideas and inspiration in that area.
I should say that this book isn't really about organizing. And it's fun to talk about it because it's a very interesting topic. But it's a subject that comes up, I think, a little bit throughout the book. But it's really about kind of what people do all day. And inevitably, these mobilizations have been kind of occurring. So they kind of appear, they're in the backdrop, and then they kind of emerge in the foreground at moments. But I wouldn't say it's a central focus of the book. You should still buy it if that disappoints you, but just to clarify, and I think that point of clarification might give us a transition to a question asked by an anonymous attendee, which is, I don't see anyone on the investment side like VC, angels or others in the book. Is there an interview with them, and if not, why not? And that's a great question, and I think maybe kind of speaks to brings us to this original question of what we were trying to do with the book, which is, in our view, and this is something we talk about a little bit in the introduction, that there are certain voices that are already quite loud in the conversation. And I think, venture capitalists have some of the loudest voices in the room, certainly on social media, but are also very well represented in the mainstream media. And it's not to say that they don't possess an immensely powerful role in this ecosystem. They absolutely do. I mean, they really do belong to this leadership class, along with executives and founders. But I think what we were hoping to do with the book was to provide a bit of a corrective to that somewhat lopsided conversation. And as Maura mentioned before, to try to bring a few different types of voices, not as many as we'd hoped to, because it's a slim book, but at least a few different types of voices into the room that we hope, we expect that people would not have heard from before. Maura, what do you think?
I should have said, you know, this book, the anonymous interview is a recurring form that we use in Logic, and we did new interviews for this book, but we continue to publish them. And all that to say, if someone knows a VC with a terrific voice who wants to spill dirt to us, we'd be happy to talk to them. But in this case, you know, this first iteration of the project, it did seem important to us to hear from people who were harder to hear from or we hadn't heard from much before. We probably have time for one or two more questions. I'm trying to see if we can bundle any of these questions together. There are two about academia, sort of, in very different ways. I could illegally try to combine them and just say there's one comment from an anonymous attendee that says, I'm an academic, and there's a sense that even academics are now working in the tech industry. We're frequently forced to use surveillance tech products, Canvas, and the horribly named Panopto. And I just wanted to flag this comment because I think, you know, in a way it's related to what Ben was just saying about how this book tries to be representative in a certain sense, and it can't be exhaustive because the tech industry is now everywhere. You know, how would one even define exactly what's a tech firm? JP Morgan employs tons of programmers. Is it a tech firm? You know, we play with this kind of question. And I do think in a real way, we're all tech workers now. I mean, particularly in the era of work from home, but even people who work in person are algorithmically managed or have schedules set algorithmically. The vast majority of us probably use smartphone apps where our attention is the commodity that makes them valuable. So in different ways, all of our voices are in the valley. We're all sort of implicated in this industry. And so I just wanted to flag that comment, both because I hate the name Panopto and have anxieties about Canvas as well as an academic, but also because I think it exactly gets to the point of why we think and hope these interviews have an appeal and a resonance beyond just people who work in the Bay Area, even though that's where we focused for this first go. And then the second question about academia, which actually isn't much related at all to the first one, was just whether there are academics we can think of, Ben, who are doing ethnographic and theoretical work, I suppose, or on the topics of this book, who we haven't had a chance to publish in Logic yet. And because I love to get to cite people, because it makes my little academic heart leap with joy, I just wanted to shout out a couple folks. Sarita Amrute, who's my colleague at Data and Society, has a very interesting book called Coding and Coding Race and Coding Class about Indian IT workers in Berlin, but really about how race and identity still shape even cognitive work or sort of mental work that's supposed to be the same whoever is doing it. There's Lily Irani's book, Chasing Innovation, about entrepreneurship in India. Brand new book, just came out last week, I think, by Sylvia Lintner, called Prototype Nation, about cultures of entrepreneurship and sort of maker culture in China. Totally fascinating. And then in a somewhat different vein, there's a book of poems, actually, called Microchips for the Millions by Janice Sapeago, who's a poet in the Bay Area, whose mother was one of many Filipina women who worked in computer chip manufacturing. And it's this experimental book of poetry and maps that I think is very cool, Microchips for the Millions. One last one is that Lisa Nakamura has a terrific article called Indigenous Circuits that's about Navajo women also involved in early computer chip manufacturing, a sort of forgotten history that she dug up out of the archives about how insourcing happened before outsourcing. So yeah, all of those women, I'll type their names in the chats, but there are really interesting academics doing important work in this area. So I'm always happy to get to mention them when I can. Ben, do you want to wrap us up?
I think that's a great place to end. I just want to thank everyone again for coming. I want to thank Harvard Bookstore, and I think Marissa is going to take us home.
Yes, thank you both very much. That was a really wonderful discussion, and thank you to the audience for joining us virtually tonight. You can learn more about this book again and purchase The Voices from the Valley at the link that I've posted in the chat. And it looks like Moira's also putting in some of those names that she mentioned.
Can't help myself. I'm sorry.
Great, that was great. So everyone take a quick screenshot of that before we end the webinar. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I just want to say again, thank you. Have a good night, keep reading, and please be well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.